Okay. Hello again, everyone. So glad to see y'all, as it were. My name is Kate Budries, and I'm the branch manager for the Glen McNary branch of the Greensboro Public Library. On behalf of the Greensboro Public Library and the Greensboro Library Foundation, welcome to tonight's program. Thank you to those of you in the audience who contribute to the foundation. It is through your support that we can offer quality programming. In partnership with the community, the Greensboro Public Library strives to provide free and equal access to information, foster lifelong learning, and inspire the joys of reading. We connect and collect. The Greensboro Public Library is your conduit to so many resources. If you don't have a library card, you can stop by your local branch to get one. They're free. You can visit www.greensborolibrary.org to find a branch near you. Did you know that we have several library databases related to health and medical information? You can browse journals and magazines through the Consumer Health Database, the Health and Medical Collection, and the Public Health Database. You can visit Medline Plus for information about medical conditions, treatments, and healthy lifestyles. And for North Carolina specific information, you can peruse the NC Health Info Database. To learn more, please contact your neighborhood branch or visit the Greensboro Public Library website. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Cheryl Greenberg.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here today. I am an age coach. Have you ever heard of that? I'm a life coach, but I work only with seniors and their families as they're going through some kind of change in their lives. You know, some people are changing their jobs, retiring, downsizing, looking for new adventures. Many times, though, the people who are experiencing change are undergoing some kind of new diagnosis of a disability or a disease such as a dementia. And in all of those cases, what people need is to talk with somebody about what's going on, what information they need, how to plan, and how they're feeling about those changes in their lives. And because of those coaching sessions that I have, I know that the topic we're going to talk about tonight is really important because people ask me all the time. I am, they will say, 50 years old, 60 years old, 80 years old, and I'm experiencing something. Is that normal? Is that a change in my body, something I can do something about? I mean, what can I expect as I get older? And so that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. What's normal, what's not, and how to make your future as healthy as possible. Let's start by just a fairly brief overview of the kinds of changes that we undergo as we get older. And after we take a look at both how our bodies and our brains change, then we'll talk about some of the ways that we can compensate for those changes so that we can be as healthy as possible throughout our lives and be able to remember and think and problem solve, that is, use our brains in really healthy ways as well. So what are we talking about? Think about yourself right now, if you would. You don't have to tell anybody how old you are if you don't want to, but think about how you are treating your body right now. For example, did you have a nutritious lunch today? Don't tell anybody, just think about it. Did you exercise 5 times in the last week? How about this? Did you run into somebody you sort of recognized in the last week or two, but you didn't know their name? Well, the answers to all those questions for you will be in what I'm going to talk about. We're going to talk about average changes. You know, overall, if we looked at all of the people in, let's just keep it to the United States, but if we looked at most people, at least here, what would it look like? How would their bodies function and change over time? How would their brains change over time? The important thing to remember as I talk about what happens on average is that you are not an average person. Each of us is unique. And so while I may experience vision changes and need glasses when I'm 40. Maybe you don't need glasses until you're 50. It's, these changes are different for different people. Overall, though, our bodies pretty much have sort of what we would call an upward trajectory for the first 20 years of our lives. In many ways, we are looking at getting stronger, getting taller, being able to problem solve better, being able to manage impulse control better. That means that our brains and our bodies are maturing over time. And that's a pretty constant direction for change for the first little parts of our lives. For the rest of our lives, for the next 85 years of our lives, most of the change is in a different direction. This does not mean we crumble and fall apart. It just means that each of the systems of our bodies, including our brain, undergo some changes which result in having a little less function, a little more need for compensation. There are some areas that just plain improve our whole lives. We'll talk about that too. But here's some examples. A convenient way to talk about bodies is to first of all talk about brains separately. I know the brain is part of the body, but I'm going to talk about body as everything but the brain, and then I'll talk about the brain separately. And I'll tell you why as we go along. Our bodies are described as having a number of systems. Of course, all these systems interact, but it is helpful to look at them one at a time where we're trying to figure out how they're changing and how healthy we are. So, for example, the cardiovascular system, of course, is our heart, our veins, our arteries, and our capillaries. It involves blood, right? Over time, the heart must, over time and gradually, for most people, there's a weakening of the cardiovascular system. The heart muscle becomes a little thicker, a little less flexible, and while it may get a little bigger over time, in fact, because the walls are thickening, the inside of the heart has a little less capacity for blood. The veins also become a little stiffer, and they may build up some plaque on the inside, and so they have a little less capacity to hold blood, to push blood through at any given time. The result is sometimes disease, like a heart attack or a stroke, but in general, it just means that our best capacity for pumping blood through our bodies is a little diminished, little by little, over the course of the life. Now, that's just an interesting fact, but it has an effect on all parts of our bodies, because why do we need a cardiovascular system? The job of blood is to take nutrients and oxygen to all the cells of our body so that the cells in whatever part of the body can do their particular jobs, whether it's the kidneys, the liver, or the brain. Also, the blood takes waste products away so that the cells can be as healthy as possible. We're going to talk about how to keep our vascular system healthy when we get to the part about, so what do we do about these changes? The musculoskeletal system changes also. So muscles, well, we lose a certain amount of muscle mass over time. And some of our muscle becomes more fibrous, less flexible. So if I had an 80-year-old man who was a bodybuilder and could lift 250 pounds, and I have a 20-year-old who's a bodybuilder and he can lift 250 pounds, there's still a difference. The guy who's 20, first of all, you can see much more muscle in the way he looks. His body's more defined. than the 80-year-old. But also the 20-year-old is probably not working he's not working at the greatest capacity he might. He's got some reserve. He's got some left over. He can lift even more weight if he keeps training. Where for an 80-year-old, while he shows some muscle, not the same physique, because he doesn't have as much muscle to show, and also he at 250 pounds, maybe at the end of his capacity, he may not be able to do any more than that. I've made up those numbers, but you understand what I'm saying. The skeleton, the bones of our body become a little weaker, little by little over time. We lose some calcium, we lose some other minerals. That means that we're, as we get older, at greater risk for breaking a bone, for losing balance and breaking a bone with the changes in our muscles and our bones. And on like that. You can, if you look at this list, you can name some of these things. We know that everyone, but not just men, but also women, has some thinning of their hair and their skin. You notice with somebody who's 80 years old that their skin looks fragile, and you can sort of, it's more translucent because there's less fat under the skin. This is not insignificant. It means it's easier to tear the skin with a minor injury, and it means that people can't control their temperature of their bodies quite as well. It's easier to be cold as you lose that fat under the skin and as the skin thins. And all of the senses change. Well, we all know that our vision changes over time, right? We expect that, there's going to be some yellowing of the lens of our eyes, and we're going to need more light. We're going to need more light to be able to read in a room than somebody who's younger. We don't see color as well. Or if we want to look at a book and then look up to see something far off, we can't change the focal length as easily. So there's a moment of blur. And hearing changes as well, although much later than vision. Did you know that also taste and smell change? And so sometimes people put, as they get older, put an increasing amount of flavoring into their food, not because their desire for more flavoring has changed, but because the taste buds, there are fewer taste buds really, and they don't take in the flavor. The brain doesn't process it in the same way it does for somebody who's young. Now, when do all these things happen? Well, remember, I said you're an individual, but on average, we can look at when these changes take place. So the changes take place slowly. But there's a time when, what I call a peak, you might say. When's your muscle strength the very best? Well, probably around 20. When's your reaction time the best? Probably around 20. You know those two, the bodybuilder, the 20-year-old bodybuilder and the 80-year-old bodybuilder? The 20-year-old tennis player and the 40-year-old tennis player have differences too, because the 40-year-old reaction time is not as fast. And so he is or she is at a slight disadvantage because they don't react quite as fast as that ball coming across the net. Vision changes, I already said this, are noticeable enough to want to do something about it. For most people, around 40. Although for some reason, none of my children seem to need glasses, and they're older than that. Cardiovascular changes that we talked about are very gradual. They are lifelong. We don't really become concerned generally about heart changes, cardiovascular changes, until about 40 to 55, unless somebody has a particular disease or congenital problem, something like that. Lifestyle has a big role to play in cardiovascular changes, so keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that in a couple minutes. You know, the gastrointestinal system, the GI system, even that slows down. And so people have a little more trouble digesting food sometimes as they get older, can't tolerate sometimes spicy foods or greasy foods the way they could when they were young and could just eat anything, they said. Hearing changes is something that, for some reason in our society, we pretend doesn't exist, don't exist. So we have no problem putting on a pair of glasses for the most part, or contact lenses, but boy, we struggle to put on a hearing aid. And yet by about 60, hearing has changed enough so that a person may need the volume on the TV a little bit louder. And as they get older, an 80-year-old is very likely, a 70-year-old is very likely to need a hearing aid in many cases. And I talked about bone strength. While it's a concern that we lose bone mass, that's minerals from our bones, throughout the entire lifespan, it's really not till older adulthood that we see these spontaneous breaks or these very easy breaks. That's when they really become more of a concern. And frankly, they become more of a concern because people's balance decreases at the same age. And so a person's more likely to fall because they can't balance as well. And when they fall, they're more likely to break a bone. So I wrote 60 here, but I'm really not as concerned about that until a little bit later for the most part. Now, let's take a look at what we call normal cognitive changes, normal changes to memory and thinking and problem solving and making judgments. Do they change also? We used to say that by the time the person was 40 years old, they simply were not as cognitively sharp as they used to be. So take that as nonsense. There are some real changes, but the changes vary from person to person again, but also from particular function, particular thing you want to do, particular thing you want to do. Let me give you a little bit of oversight here because this is not something we grew up learning about. So here's a picture, it's a sketch, cartoon really of a brain, isn't it? What I want you to see in here is that there are different regions of the brain, and each region of the brain has its own particular job to do. It has really its own responsibility to do. So, for example, in this pink area, we see the frontal lobe, and you put your hand up on your forehead, slap your forehead, and you're pretty much in the right place. This is a place where where thinking takes place, and some decision making and making good judgments. In fact, we say the frontal lobe is the last part of the frontal lobe, or the last part of the brain to develop fully. And you may have heard that there's been an increasing concern about expecting too much responsibility from teenagers because their frontal lobe is not fully developed, and they make judgments that as an older person, older than a teenager, you would think are sort of silly. Well, part of that is that the brains aren't fully developed yet, seriously. Now, the blue part, broadly speaking, is about language and touch and senses like that. The green part is more about sight. That's called the occipital lobe. Here in this yellow part, but not on the surface, but deep down, is the hippocampus. And keep that in mind because the hippocampus is on the side in the temporal lobe and pretty deep in. And what that does is it has major responsibility for memory. That's where memories are largely formed and stored. This purple part is awfully important. It's the brain stem, and it's responsible for automatic behaviors, things that we really couldn't begin to control. I mean, not in a real way. For a second, you could control them, like breathing and heart rate, temperature of the body, swallowing. So, of course, you can decide to swallow, but you need the brain stem to make those automatic behaviors. Now, here's how the brain works. All these parts, while they look like they each have their own job, can't work alone, right? If you're trying to remember a trip to Atlanta 15 months ago, we're going to have some stories, some words, some language that we know about. We're going to have memories of seeing people. We're going to recall tastes and sights and other senses. All the parts of the brain are going to have, or many of the parts of the brain anyway, are going to have a role in remembering just that trip to Atlanta. The other thing to remember is that over time, the brain gets a little smaller, gets a little slower, and that we can keep it as strong as possible. So what is affected when we think about cognitive health or memory changes as we get older? Not everything. If anybody tells you that as you get older, well, you're not going to have a very good memory, that's really not good information. We are most likely, as we get older, to have more trouble remembering events, things that happened recently, things that we are trying to remember under pressure. Oh my goodness, there's so much going on today. I've got a doctor's appointment. I've got to find my keys. I have no idea where I put them. And what's the name of that doctor anyway? I can't. That's memory under pressure. And also, and this is awfully important, and this is something we can all do something about, our working memory. Have you ever heard of working memory? Working memory is what you're doing with information right this second, in the moment. So right this second, you're listening to my words, you're taking some of them in, they're sitting on a little workbench in your brain called the working memory. Lots of my words, ideas about memory, ideas about what problems we might have with memory. And now somebody texts you. You glance over to your phone. What happens to my words that you're listening to? They fall off your workbench. They fall out of your working memory. You get distracted. And so the text has an impact on how well you can remember what's happening in the moment. As we get older, we have more and more trouble keeping our focus on what we're trying to hear or think about or learn right this second. If a child tells you that they can listen to music, check their text messages, and study for an exam at the same time, they're kidding you and they're kidding themselves. We can't do multiple things at exactly the same time. But the older we get, we can shift back and forth. Look at the message, go back to the test prep, listen to the music, go back to and it happens quickly. We don't notice that we're not actually doing all these things at the same time. As we get older, being interrupted by the text or having the music on becomes an even greater problem because we have more trouble keeping our focus or our attention on whatever it is we're doing at the moment. Other things are not affected as much. So it is not reasonable to think that you can't remember information you learned last week or a story you heard some time ago that you've been practicing. It was important to you, and it's something that happened at I don't know, your wedding or at work, or those longer term memories stay with us much better. As does language. Language does not ever get impacted. We remember what words mean, and we can speak and we can read and understand language for our whole lives unless we develop a disease like a dementia. The other thing that's really important, and that's the last thing on this slide, I want you to look at that. We can learn things forever too, unless we have a dementia. There are a lot of reasons for the changes in memory. It may be that, no, it certainly is. I shouldn't say it may be. The system one system we didn't talk about was the neurological system. I saved it for this. But I did talk about reaction time, and that's actually a question of the nervous system, the neurological system. We slow down a little. And so we can't hit the tennis ball quite as quickly because we don't react quite as quickly. Similarly, when we try to remember something, it seems to take a little bit longer for our brains to fire up from the time, let's say, we're asked a question to the time we search our brains and then respond. It takes a little bit longer as we get older. Not like you can check your watch to do that most of the time, but I can certainly see it in a lab setting, in a laboratory setting. People also think that one of the reasons that we have some changes in memory is because we just have more stuff in our brain. And if we don't organize and try to remember, put some effort into remembering, then in fact what happens is it's harder to find. It's like a stuffed file cabinet. You know, I knew his name, but I didn't spend too much time thinking about it. And now I don't know. Where if we had taken time to say, oh, his name is Fred, and yeah, I can picture that name, and you know, I think he sort of looks like a Fred, or he doesn't look like a Fred, and his name is Fred. That's my cousin's name. When you go through those kinds of sort of practice, or what you're doing is you're actually spending a little bit more effort trying to remember, it's easier to find the memory later on. That's just healthy memory changes. You're going to expect that you will have some slowing of memory, but still be pretty capable of memory for your whole lifespan unless you're sick. Now, I do want to spend just a minute, because people are generally curious about this. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the non-normal. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this stuff. There are some things that happen with aging that don't inevitably happen. We can't say that just because you get older, you're going to have these problems. But some people, when they're depressed or they're stressed or they're using alcohol or drugs, are going to have memory problems because of those conditions or behaviors. Some diseases have an impact on our brains. Even medications can. In many cases, you can reverse those changes if you recognize that there's a reason for the memory change and you have appropriate treatment. So for example, and this is the most important example that I can think of, is if a person is dehydrated, they haven't been taking in enough fluids, particularly as they get older, or they have an infection. They have the most common infection among older adults is a urinary tract infection. That doesn't sound like it's a big deal, but it actually affects not just the body, but the brain. Somebody who's dehydrated or has a urinary tract infection is likely to have a memory problem. As soon as they get hydrated, they get a lot of more fluids in their body, or they take medication for the urinary tract infection, guess what? Their memories are better. So that's a temporary kind of a memory problem. And I'm talking most about memory, but it goes for thinking and problem solving too. Now, there's something called mild cognitive impairment. This is these people who have mild cognitive impairment have a significant amount of memory and problem solving, but particularly memory changes. Enough so it's annoying and enough so people notice. But the person is perfectly capable of carrying on their activities of daily living, taking care of themselves, doing what they need to do. They just have more memory problems than most people. This is not an illness. It's not a dementia. But it may, in some cases, develop into a dementia. Or it may, in some cases, actually be an early subclinical stage of a dementia. And finally, there are real dementias, and they are diseases. They are not expected parts of aging. They are diseases, just like it becomes more common to have heart disease or cancer as somebody gets older. It becomes more common, but it's not inevitable. And dementia means that there's an actual disease in the brain that is damaging the brain so that the person can't think and use language and have a good and remember things, and has significant impact on their ability to take care of themselves, to take care of those activities of daily living. Now, I have said a tremendous amount. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat right now. And if it's something that we want to stop and answer right now because it's pertinent, right, or else I will, or else, I'll answer at the end. Keep in mind that our bodies stay pretty healthy over time, and so do our brains. We may slow down a little, we may feel a little overloaded, we may not be able to lift that terrific weight or remember somebody's name quickly as we get older, but we can do all of those things with time. We can even build our bodies up and build our brains up. So how are we going to do that? What is something, you can put it in the chat if you want to just think about it, is something that you have done recently that is a new habit you have for keeping yourself healthy? Let me give you some ideas. Did you write, is anything in the chat?
Not yet. I'm keeping an eye on it. So.
Okay. So let me just go through some of these. And again, if you have a question, go ahead and jot it down because I know I'm covering an awful lot of material at one time. In order to stay healthy, keep your whole body healthy and your brain, there are a number of things that we can do, and I've just sort of divided them up into convenient little bites here. A lot of people say that the number one thing you can do for your brain and your body is exercise. I'm going to tell you in a minute that might be number two, but it's awfully, awfully important. Why? Well, there are just lots of reasons. First of all, when you exercise, you're building up your cardiovascular system. And I've already told you how important it is to get that blood flowing through your body to your brain and away from your brain and other parts of your body so that you can nourish your brain, get oxygen to your brain, and take waste products away from your brain. But cardiovascular exercise is even important for, directly important for your brain. When you exercise, we see that people's memories are stronger. Their hippocampus, where the memories happen, actually is bigger. So it's not just the blood supply. There's a direct relationship on how your brain, on the anatomy of your brain when you do cardiovascular. You know what cardiovascular is, right? You're getting your heart rate up. You should break a sweat. You should be a little out of breath. To be healthy, you really probably do not need to do high intensity training, but you do want to not just be taking a leisurely stroll. You get some points for gardening, for house cleaning, for walking, for running, but you got to do it with some intensity so that you are getting your heart rate up, you're strengthening your heart muscle. And The National Institute of Health in 2018, actually November 11th, 2018, came out with new recommendations for cardiovascular exercise. And they say that we should do 150 to 300 minutes of vigorous, but moderately vigorous exercise every week. Clearly don't have to do that at one time, but if you did 150 minutes, that would just be 30 minutes a day for 5 days, right? In addition, you should do some weight-bearing exercises, where you push and pull against something. And you should do that 2 to 3 times a day. And as I said, balance becomes a problem the older we get. And so you want to do some balance and flexibility training as well. I know it sounds like a commitment, and I suggest that people start slowly, gradually build up, do something you enjoy, because if it's something you don't enjoy, you're unlikely to keep it up. And it's really a good idea to do it with somebody else because it's more fun. And so you're more likely to stay at it. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not being obese is a problem for health, and that's recent controversy. It used to be clear. I don't think that's decided yet, but we do know that we need to watch our weight, and we particularly need to watch increase in weight over the years, even more than keeping the same weight. That increase can be problematic. We want to be concerned. We are concerned about fat, particularly belly fat. You can read about that it leads to inflammation in the body, and inflammation is hard on the cells. I won't go into that deeply, but it's something to look at. You also want to be sure to have enough fluids, and as I mentioned before, people get dehydrated. That is a problem. As we get older, our bodies don't use fluids as efficiently, and so we want to be sure we're getting adequate fluids throughout the lifespan. And in terms of eating, here's a model that's really useful. The Mediterranean diet is a good model for a healthy diet, because basically it includes high fiber, small portions of lean protein. Not a pound of steak. We're talking about a few ounces of fish or lean chicken, for example. Healthy fats. Our bodies absolutely need fat. Our cells need fat. Our nerves need fat. But we want to use healthy fats like olive oil. And really a good way to think about this, and carbohydrates. You don't want to eliminate carbohydrates. You want to have complex carbohydrates. So not white bread, whole grain bread to be an example. On the other hand, I was sorry to say that a good example of this is to think about a plate that is colorful, that over the course of several days or a week, you eat all kinds of colors of fruits and vegetables, and many, many portions of those. So fruit and vegetables, and then small amounts of healthy fats, healthy protein, healthy carbohydrates is a good way to think about it. On the other hand, the diet that we really love when we go to, what's the name of that restaurant? A Biscuitville. That is so delicious, but biscuits and high-fat meats and processed foods that have chemicals and ingredients that the names of which you can't read, you ought to check out to see if they're good for you. Trans fats, saturated. I wouldn't use any trans fats. Saturated fats are problematic, but you can't avoid them entirely. Sugar has been taken a lot of heat about being appropriate. It is a simple carbohydrate, and there are people who believe that it's directly related to disease. So I would recommend that you find out a lot about how to, those kinds of foods. Here's a picture of the Mediterranean diet. Isn't that pretty? Lots of color, lots of vegetables. It is actually related to healthier bodies directly, so that we see a deep relationship between the Mediterranean diet and lowered rates of diabetes, heart disease, bone disease, osteoporosis, and even Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. Of course, at the same time, it's important to get regular medical checkups. We want to get physical screenings and mental and cognitive screenings. It's actually part of Medicare requirement that when a doctor does a yearly and annual wellness check for a person who's on Medicare, that they check both their bodies and their brains, if you will, their cognition. And we want to keep up our vaccinations. I know that's been a topic of great controversy recently with the COVID vaccine, but there are lots of vaccines that we need to keep up, including, is your tetanus shot up to date? Shingrix, hepatitis, all those, a variety of vaccinations that as adults we need. It's not just children who get vaccinations, of course. And you can check that out with your physician. Also, be very sure that when you take medications that you know what they are, that you monitor side effects and you monitor drug interactions. Many times when people have problems with energy or with remembering well or thinking well, it has to do with the medications they're taking because of side effects or interactions. And now take a big deep breath and feel any stress you have in your body going away. We all live with stress. We have to. Having to get dinner on the table is a kind of a stress. But if you're living with constant chronic stress, it would be good to find a way to diminish that, because chronic stress actually releases hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, which have a negative effect. They actually damage our bodies. So we want to minimize stress, and we can do that. We can do it with yoga and meditation. We can do it with deep breathing. We can do it by just doing an activity that we really love that takes us away from the stressful situation. The opposite is true too, finding ways to be happy and to feel a sense of satisfaction with what you're doing, and exercise all release healthy hormones like serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine. You know those names? Those endorphins, those healthy hormones, do the opposite. They don't damage our brains, they damage our bodies. They build up. They help the cells in our bodies repair themselves and actually, in some cases, grow new cells, additional cells. And here it comes. This is the part that I said may replace exercise as number one. I'm not going to say much about this because next week our whole session is going to be on talking about socialization. And we're going to share, I'm going to speak less, and the participants will be able to contribute a great deal if they want to. But it appears that socializing, having good, strong relationships with other people, may be as important or even more important than all the other things we talked about for staying healthy. Doesn't mean the other things aren't important. You still don't want to eat, lard every day. But being in relationships that are enjoyable, that involve challenges, conversations, mutual caring, helps to reduce our stress, makes us feel better about ourselves, increases the chance that we will exercise, that we will do good things for ourselves. And so we will talk about that more next week. And the very last thing that I wanted to mention is everything that I've said so far has been about ways to keep your body and your brain healthy. There are some direct things you can do to keep your brain healthy alone. And that's something I call ACE your brain. Maybe one day next winter we'll do a session at McNary about that. But the short version of this is something that I alluded to a little while ago. And that is that when we use our brains actively, we increase the pathways, the connections among the brain cells. The more we practice what we're trying to remember, the more we make ourselves solve problems that don't come easily, the more pathways we're building in our brains. In a sense, not literally, but in a sense, this is strengthening our brains. I mean, our brain's not a muscle, so not really strengthening it, but we're building up the capacity of our brain to do even more remembering and more problem solving as we actively use our brains. So sometimes when we don't remember something, always when we don't remember something nowadays, we Google it. No, slow down. Try to remember before you ask somebody the answer or ask Google the answer, look it up on the internet. We want to actively make demands of our brain. In fact, we want to challenge our brain. So the word ACE is an A and a C, and we're at the challenge. We want to try new things because, again, you're building up more pathways in your brain. You're making your brain better able to remember and to think when we challenge it. So learn something new. Never built a birdhouse? Today is the day. Somebody else does all the cooking, learn how to do it. If you've always been interested in World War II or Baroque design, learn more about it. Go to the library, take out a book. If you want to learn more about brains, do it. Because every time you challenge yourself to learn something new and to solve a new problem, you are making your brain healthier. And the E stands for be engaged. And what I mean by that is make a commitment to staying as healthy, keeping your brain as healthy as you can by using it. And now I can't advance the slides, so we may be done. There we go. The very last thing I want to say is that I've said so much today. We have, I don't know if Kate put the link on to the chat or not, but I have a handout for you. And if you email me at theagecoach@gmail.com, I will be happy to send you the information that I've been talking about. There's a lot to remember. Most importantly, though, I would suggest to you that you realize that you can stay healthy and productive and satisfied by making little changes in the way you live your life. But you have to make a plan. I suggest that people actually write down what they're going to do to make changes, put it on the refrigerator so you can see it every day, and get to work on it. Do it. And I think you'll see over time that you'll see improvement in body and brain, and you'll feel pretty good about yourself. Finally, I suggest you congratulate yourself for learning about this and then for making a plan and doing it. Now, do you have any questions?